The name Baron Titus Rivendare might ring a few bells for many people. In life, he was a rich landowner with a son named Arius. They called Stratholme their home, and Titus was generally a well-liked man. People respected him, and he seemed to do good deeds, as was shown by a paladin's reaction when he sent grain to a village, which, unknown to the soldier, was tainted with the plague of undeath. His fall from grace was not known for some time, as Kel'Thuzad, the leader of the Cult of the Damned and a friend of the Baron, had recruited him into the cult. From that point on, things changed. There is no clear indication that Rivendare was promised anything specific in return. However, I would guess he was promised the possibility of greater power, a longer life, or the preservation of his fortune, much like the Barov family of Caer Darrow. Whatever the reason for his turn, he was one of the newest members of the cult at the time, and was ready to help further its goals. Sometime later, during the Third War following Arthas' departure to Northrend, a shipment of grain was sent to a village protected by a paladin named Thomas Thompson. When Thomas first received word of the shipment, he was relieved. Finally, fresh food had arrived for the struggling villagers. That night, however, as Thomas prayed within the walls of the church, in a town still recovering from a recent scourge attack, an odd sound caught his attention. A low growling echoed outside, something he could not immediately understand. When he looked out the window, he saw a sight that shook him to his core. Walking toward the church were the townspeople themselves, a wave of death advancing on the holy warrior. These were the people he had sworn to protect, to heal, to keep safe. He had failed them once, but he would not let them down again. He knew what had to be done. Men, women, and children were only trying to endure a nightmare they never chose, turned into undead monsters, a hell forced upon them. Thomas steeled himself. With a charge and a leap, he burst through the church doors and into the fray, swinging his blade in a desperate attempt to end the threat. But there were too many. Nearly 1,000 souls filled that town, and he was faced with the terrible truth that he will have to end them all. Calling out to the light above, Thomas begged for its aid. His plea was answered. A single pillar of holy fire descended from the heavens, striking the ground with devastating force and obliterating the undead with one massive blow. When the dust settled and Thomas took in the destruction before him, death caused by the Baron's actions, he could do nothing but drop his sword. The blade sank into the earth as the exhausted paladin collapsed to his knees, tears in his eyes. In anguish, he cursed the man responsible, whispering, "The Baron has much to answer for." Thomas later reported the incident to the leaders of the Silver Hand, but Rivendare was not brought to justice at the time. There were simply too many other crises demanding their attention. At some point following that incident, Baron Rivendare became a Death Knight, though the exact moment of his transformation is unknown. The next time he was encountered, he ruled over Stratholme, placed there by the Lich King, who had made the ruined city Rivendare's domain to defend. Although Rivendare did not enter this new existence alone, he chose to bring his favored steed with him, slaying the horse and raising it into undeath as his death charger. Later, Rivendare captured a woman named Ysida Harmon, a member of the Argent Dawn. Though she had proudly joined the order to help fight the undead menace sweeping the land, her husband, Antheon, believed it to be a foolish crusade. When he learned of her capture, Antheon rode out to rescue her from Rivendare's grasp. Despite his valor, he was slain by the Baron and his undead forces. Still, hope was not entirely lost. Adventurers were sent to investigate, and upon finding Antheon's ghost outside of Stratholme, he agreed to provide information, on the condition that they either rescue Ysida or recover her body from Rivendare's clutches. Venturing into the ever-burning ruins of the city, the adventurers eventually found Ysida, imprisoned by the Baron within the slaughterhouse. A fierce battle followed, with Ysida cheering them on. Blade, shield, and spell struck true. Blow after blow, cast after cast, until Rivendare was finally defeated and Ysida freed. Yet even then, the Baron's story was not yet over. Though Rivendare had lost that fight, he was raised once more and continued his grim vigil over Stratholme. Eventually, another attempt was made to end his reign, this time with the aid of his son, Arius, who had gone on to join the Silver Hand, but was trapped within Alonza's chapel. An eternal flame held his curse at bay, preventing his transformation into a Death Knight, while a medallion retrieved by adventurers suppressed the plague threatening to claim him and allowed Arius to venture out of the chapel. Together, the group went further into Stratholme in one final attempt to destroy Rivendare for good. This time, the Baron truly fell, but not without claiming one last victim. Arius suffered fatal wounds at his father's hands and died near him in the ruined city. Though the monster was finally defeated, Arius was denied a peaceful end. He was later raised into undeath, becoming the very thing he had fought so long to avoid, and would rule over Stratholme himself for years to come. Years later, above the frozen wastes of Dragonblight in Northrend, Naxxramas appeared once more, floating high above the land to aid the Lich King in his war against the living. Within its walls, a familiar figure emerged in the military quarter, Baron Titus Rivendare, reborn as one of the Four Horsemen. Alongside Thane Korthas, Lady Blommaw, and Sir Zeliek, the heroes of Azeroth faced a battle few were prepared for, but through sheer willpower and determination, the Horsemen were defeated. Rivendare was destroyed once more, this time seemingly for good. Though he's not been seen since, either in Azeroth or the Shadowlands, the Baron's fate remains uncertain, and in a world where death itself can be undone, it is always possible he is simply waiting for the right moment to return. The island of Caer Darrow in Western Plaguelands used to be a thriving area and home to a family which owned much of the surrounding area, which included Caer Darrow, Brill, Southshore, and Terran Mill. However, 6 years after the Dark Portal opened, they started to fall to their own desires before the dead ever got there. Their greed and rage came along with the depression that couldn't be lifted from their shoulders. In hopes of quelling their emotions and satiating that greed, the family made a decision that would lead the Butcher to be brought into their lives, with a deal struck between the family and the human mage Kel'Thuzad. They got to hold on to their fortune and extend their lifespan by many years. But unknown to them, Kel'Thuzad was the leader of the Cult of the Damned, and they were about to be inducted into the cult, whether they wanted to be or not. All except one. Their life of luxury and privilege vanished as within 6 months following the massacre on the island, their once beautiful home had fell into an unrecognizable state, with the cult taking over and only one member of their family escaping the slaughter. Well done. The youngest son in the family was able to escape with his humanity, but the rest of his family wasn't so lucky. Alexei Barov became a Death Knight. His wife Elucia and daughter Jandis were turned into undead ghosts, and then the last son, Alexei, was risen into undeath, but he was able to break free and join Sylvanas' Forsaken. But within this new hellscape for any living person not associated with the cult, a new level of pain and suffering awaited them by the main torturer. Dr. Theolan Krastinov, also known as the Butcher at this point, is a man that loved his work, and had a lust for power that had him pushing himself to experiment more and more, which he had plenty of specimens to practice his craft with, starting with the servants that were in the Barov household. He trapped, tortured, and maimed them for months, only keeping them alive by magical means. 2 of the servants, the head maid Eva and her husband Lucian, who was Alexei's butler, were able to survive within the walls of the keep and only coming out when they felt it was safe to try to get food to survive. But they couldn't escape. And each day they heard the pain of others as Krastinov worked his knives with a special delight. But in time they were found and subjected to pain unimaginable for weeks on end. And even when they would die, the Butcher would bring them right back and keep experimenting on them. But even as their final death came at his hands, it was short-lived, as Krastinov brought them back one more time and fed them to the ghouls. And finally they were free of the pain physically. But their spirits were trapped there until an adventurer comes to the House of Horrors. Outside of the mansion, Eva and Lucian's spirits are hoping that someone will hear their plea. And when one is finally willing to listen, Eva goes on to describe her last months alive. The undead surrounded us, constantly tormenting us with horrifying acts of depravity. Finally, he came. He introduced himself as Dr. Theolan Krastinov. We came to know him as the Butcher. We finally understood what the screams were from. The Butcher exposed us to pain that we did not know existed. He used us in countless experiments to devise a plague. The days turned to weeks. We would have died on that first day had it not been for that cruel bastard keeping us alive through magical means. We feel nothing. Our souls remain here in limbo. We are unable to leave until our remains are found and spirits laid to rest. They say that the Reaper's scythe comes for everyone eventually, and it finally sliced through the Butcher as he did with so many of his victims. but you can't keep a good monster down. As later on, when Dark Master Gandling took over the school, he revived the Butcher back into undeath, as he felt he could still be useful to the Scourge. So with a new lease on life, he went back to what he was born to do. And while with the Scourge, he trained different students who were sent to the Plaguelands. He wrote a book called Crimes Against Anatomy, and even had a number of students at Scholomance be surgically altered to look like him. But nothing lasts forever, and finally the monster was put down for good. Upon his final death, he went to the Shadowlands, and the realm Rivendare, where the Venthyr tried countless times to purge him of the lust for power that pushed him in life to commit his atrocities. But it is an ongoing process, and his Sin Stone, which is located near the Halls of Atonement, reads, Theolan Krastinov, once respected, admired, a noble physician. Yet Krastinov succumbed to a dark lust for knowledge and power. In his madness, thousands of innocents were tortured and slain. In his madness, their blood was used for a plague that killed thousands more. Thus, the Doctor became the Butcher. Madness is no excuse for sins as grievous as these. Repentance is the only answer. Purge his greed, his lust for power, and perhaps he can be redeemed. In the heart of Duskwood, where the mists cling to gravestones and the dead do not rest, a lone figure wanders the ruins of Ravenhill, his armor rusted, his mind broken, his blade still drawn. They say he was once a noble knight, but grief carved wounds so deep that not even death could close it. Now he roams in silence, searching for something long lost, or someone. Before the name Mor'Ladim was etched into gravestone in fear, he had another, Morgan Lattimore, a knight once known for his unwavering compassion. In his youth, he had taken up arms not for glory but to protect the weak, the poor, and the voiceless. At 18, he wed a girl named Liz, and together they built a quiet life, blessed with 3 children in the warmth of a home untouched by war. But peace never lingers long in this world. When Morgan was 32, the banners of war rose across Lordaeron, and he answered the call without hesitation. He rode beneath the banner of the Silver Hand, fighting beside Uther himself. And as the war deepened, so too did the wounds upon his spirit. He bore witness to horrors beyond reckoning. The order of paladins shattered, Uther slain, the plague of undeath sweeping like rot through the cities of the living. And while Morgan bled for the light abroad, darkness crept into his home. When the war at last ended, Morgan Lattimore returned home a weary man, yearning for the peace he had fought to protect. But the land that greeted him was not the one he had left behind. His homestead lay in ruin, the fields burned, the air heavy with silence. Seeking word of his family, he rode to Grand Hamlet, now a hollowed town known as Darkshire, and begged for news. The villagers spoke carefully, their eyes downcast, until one finally told him that those he sought might be found among the graves of Ravenhill. He refused to believe it. With desperate hope, he turned toward Lakeshire, clinging to denial like a shield. Yet something within him, a quiet, dreadful knowing, pulled his reins toward the cemetery instead. Among the leaning stones and overgrown grass, he searched for hours, calling names swallowed by the wind. At last, he found them. 3 graves half buried in ivy, 2 bearing the names of his children, one of his beloved Liz. The 3rd was missing, but Morgan saw nothing through the haze of his sorrow. Grief curdled into madness. He fell to his knees and struck at the gravestones with his blade, each swing a cry of anguish. When the caretakers rushed to stop him, he turned upon them, his sword cutting through the living as easily as the dead. And when the rage finally broke, he stood trembling, his armor slick with blood, not of enemies, but of innocents. Overcome with horror, the knight drew his dagger and drove it deep into his own heart. They found the bodies the next morning, the caretakers torn where they fell, and Morgan Lattimore slumped beside the shattered stones of his family's grave. No songs were sung, no rites performed. Perhaps out of mercy or fear, or simply a desire to bury one more horror beneath the soil. The people of Darkshire laid him to rest in a nameless patch of earth on the edge of Ravenhill Cemetery. No marker stood watch, only silence. But the grave did not hold. In the days that followed, the soil was found disturbed, the coffin split, its occupant gone. Morgan's grief had sunk so deep, his guilt so sharp, that death itself had not been enough to silence it. Twisted by sorrow and the weight of innocent blood, he rose as something no longer truly man, not mindless, but bound to a single hollow purpose. He wandered the lands he had once sworn to protect, his sword now turned upon the living, slaying without reason, travelers, peasants, and young adventurers sent with more courage than wisdom to stop him. The people of Duskwood came to know him by another name, Mor'Ladim, and whispered it with dread. Now, Commander Althea Ebenlock seeks to end his cursed vigil, not out of vengeance, but to return him at last to the rest he was denied. But the tale did not end with Mor'Ladim's fall. There was one more thread trembling quietly in the dark, a name he had never spoken aloud, not even in undeath. One who had survived the war, the silence, and the years of wandering. Her name was Sarah Lattimore. And though she wore the mantle of a watcher now, her heart still bore the weight of a daughter abandoned by both grief and fate. When the outsider came to her, she met the news with a stillness that concealed the ache behind her eyes. She listened, quiet and unmoving, until her gaze finally fell. There was no shock, only a sorrow long buried. She confessed that she had always wished for a chance to speak with him, to say something that might have pulled him back from the edge. But time had stolen that chance. The wound remained. And yet, there was still something she could offer. From her hand, she slipped a plain silver ring, worn smooth with age and memory, and gave it to the outsider with quiet instruction. Take it to his grave. Let him know that she had survived, and that no blame remained. Her voice wavered as she did so, but her words held the strength of release. Although she couldn't forgive him, she could understand. The return to Ravenhill was different now. The wind no longer bit with anger, the trees no longer whispered his name in warning. When the ring was placed upon the grave, the air stirred, and a presence, softer now, no longer bound by rage, seemed to awaken. He knew her. Somehow, even across the veil, he felt her name. And with that knowing, the burden that had chained him for so long began to lift. At peace at last, the spirit of Morgan Lattimore gave up the blade he had once carried in life, Arceus. A sword once forged for justice, dulled by madness, and now passed on in quiet redemption. He had no more need for it, but perhaps, he believed, it could still serve the light through another hand. And then, as the fog rolled low across the graves, he spoke a final name, not to the living, but to the one he had loved and lost. And with that, he faded into silence. The Blue Dragonflight consists of dragons wielding immense magical power, and among them was Sapphiron, one of the most ancient members of their flight. As befit his age and standing, he was entrusted with a key to the Focusing Iris, an artifact of immense arcane power that would later play a pivotal role during the Nexus War. As time passed, Sapphiron eventually came to dwell in the snow-covered mountains of Northrend, near the entrance to Azul Nurub, where he guarded many powerful artifacts he had collected over the centuries of his long life. But his end was drawing near. Before Arthas and Anubarak began their journey to Icecrown through Azul Nurub to aid their master, Anubarak spoke of a dragon dwelling in a nearby cave, rumored to guard a massive treasure. When they entered the cavern, Sapphiron demanded to know why they dared trespass in his lair. Arthas answered honestly, telling the dragon that they had come to kill him and claim whatever treasures he possessed. Though Sapphiron appreciated his honesty, he was a mighty dragon capable of slaying countless foes, and wouldn't go down easy. But Arthas was no ordinary enemy. With much of his remaining strength, Arthas struck Sapphiron down swiftly, but not without cost. The battle left the Death Knight drained and weakened. Even so, Arthas raised the fallen dragon into undeath, binding him to fight as a warrior of the Scourge. As they made their way back toward the path through Azul Nurub, Arthas and his allies found their route blocked by dwarves. Then, with a cry from the heavens, Sapphiron descended from the sky and shattered the barrier, allowing them to pass. However, he did not accompany Arthas any further, As the Death Knight remarked, the confines of the earth are no place for him. Sapphiron would not be seen again for several years, until he was stationed within Naxxramas. Within those dread halls, he served as the final defense of Kel'Thuzad, guarding the Lich within his frozen domain aboard the Necropolis. After Naxxramas was defeated, once while hovering over the Plaguelands, the Lich King still had use for both Sapphiron and Kel'Thuzad. Both of them were recovered, restored to undeath once more, and Naxxramas was transported to Dragonblight, where they would meet their final deaths before being sent into the Shadowlands. Upon Sapphiron's defeat, adventurers discovered the key to the focusing iris on his corpse, an artifact crucial in the battle against Malygos, who at the time was waging war against all mortal spellcasters, believing they had abused magic beyond their right. The focusing iris gave Azeroth's champions the chance they needed to bring down the aspect of magic. However, Sapphiron's final chapter in the Shadowlands was a brief one. Once again, he was used as a tool by Kel'Thuzad, this time to cover the Lich's escape from the Necrolord Mawwalkers. As he had before in Naxxramas, Sapphiron fought with relentless resolve, but this time his end was truly final. Sometime later, the Mawwalkers eventually caught up to Kel'Thuzad and put an end to his schemes, closing the last chapter of the ancient blue dragon's long and sometimes tragic existence. Arcanagos was a blue dragon who would eventually befriend Egwene, the former guardian. One day, she sensed a powerful spell being cast, one she would later learn was used to open the Dark Portal, allowing the orcs to travel from Draenor to Azeroth. Nearly every creature attuned to magic across Azeroth felt that disturbance. But while Arcanagos and other magical beings could sense that something was wrong, only Egwene was powerful enough to determine where it had occurred. When she eventually reached the source of the disturbance in the Black Morass, Egwene uncovered Medivh's betrayal and realized he had joined the Legion. She knew she had to speak with her son and uncover what had happened to him. Together with her friend Arcanagos, she traveled to Karazhan, where Medivh was hosting a grand celebration. More than 100 guests filled the tower, enjoying the night and momentarily forgetting their troubles. Egwene hoped to convince Medivh to come clean and relinquish his power peacefully. Arcanagos waited outside while she entered the tower and searched for her son, eventually locating him on the terrace. She confronted Medivh and attempted to make him see the error of his ways. But to her shock, Medivh was no longer himself. The truth that emerged shook her to her core. Medivh was fully possessed by Sargeras. His own will suppressed so completely that he had no awareness of what was happening. It was Sargeras who now spoke. He explained that although Egwene had destroyed his avatar years earlier, she had only won that single battle, not the war itself. When his avatar was destroyed, Sargeras embedded a fragment of his soul within Egwene without her knowledge, subtly influencing the distrust she already felt toward the Council. This manipulation drove her into isolation, keeping her away from Dalaran. When she later became pregnant with Medivh, Sargeras seized his opportunity. His essence passed into Medivh while he was still in the womb, where it lay dormant until the moment came to seize control and set in motion the events that had led them to this confrontation. As the truth sank in, countless questions swirled through Egwene's mind, but fear and confusion soon gave way to a burning rage. In that moment, she knew one thing for certain. Even if it cost Medivh his life, Sargeras would die that night. The Battle of the Mages began. Arcane blasts tore through the air as Sargeras infused fell power into Medivh's magic, forcing Egwene to relive her ancient battle with him. The force of their attacks shook Karazhan's foundation, sending guests fleeing in panic as debris fell around them, and chaos erupted throughout the tower. Arcanagos rushed toward the terrace to aid Egwene, but just before he arrived, she was struck by a blast that disoriented her and left her struggling to rise. Seeing his friend injured stirred Arcanagos to action, and he charged forward, unleashing a beam of arcane energy at Sargeras. Though Arcanagos was a mighty dragon, his power was insignificant compared to Sargeras's. Egwene was forced to watch in horror as her friend was burned alive from the inside out, his screams echoing in her mind as he collapsed into ash and bone before her eyes. She would not lose another friend. Rage surged through Egwene as she rejoined the fight. Though the battle at first seemed to favor Sargeras, she endured, slowly reclaiming ground, spell by spell. While Sargeras had the full power of the Guardian at his fingertips, Egwene had centuries of experience. Desperate to end the confrontation, Sargeras drained the life force from Karazhan's guests, condemning hundreds of innocent souls to a cursed existence as spirits bound eternally to the tower. Egwene sensed that the end was near and braced herself for a final strike, but it never came. In a brief moment of clarity, Medivh resurfaced, regaining just enough control and giving his mother a glimpse of her boy one more time before he banished his mother from Karazhan, sending her far away to safety, though neither of them knew where she would land. Egwene would live in isolation for many years after these events, until her path eventually crossed with Jaina Proudmoore, beginning a new chapter of her life. Many years later, adventurers were sent into Karazhan to retrieve an arcane essence from the remains of Arcanagos. The only way to obtain it was to resurrect the dragon. When Arcanagos had been slain, the magic that killed him infused his remains with immense arcane power, and the Violet Eye sought to harness it. When he was restored, however, he was no longer the dragon he once was. Gone was the wise and compassionate blue dragon who aided his allies. In his place stood an undead monstrosity, wreathed in flame, his flesh largely gone save for what remained on his wings to keep him aloft. His aggression was that of a rabid beast, no friends, only enemies. After a brutal battle, Arcanagos was put down once more and his arcane essence harvested. Yet, his story did not end there. Years later, during an expedition across the Eastern Kingdoms, Matthias Shaw and Captain Flynn Fairwind returned to Karazhan. In his report, Shaw noted that the grounds remained as haunted as ever, with spirits roaming both inside and outside the tower. Worse still, Arcanagos, now known as Nightbane, continued to claim lives. Shaw wrote, "The last agents I sent to speak to Medivh's Shade said the hulking mass of reanimated dragon bones appeared just after engaging. Or at least, so says the Scorched Intelligence Report. As skeletons and flame alike obey Nightbane's command. To watch one step would be an understatement." And that's going to do it for this one. Hopefully you all enjoyed. Thanks for checking it out. See you in the next one. And please, do take care of yourself.